May it please the court. I stand in this hallowed chamber in this historic proceeding on behalf of the duly elected Attorney General of the state of Texas. The prosecution and the press, and I'm sure here, will tell a whopping story. It's a tale full of sound and fury. It signifies nothing. And you may wonder why I say that. Because when we are done, I believe that no matter your party affiliation, and no matter where you stand now, you will conclude what I have concluded, that there is nothing to this. Ken Paxton gave nothing of significance to Nate Paul. Nate Paul received nothing of significance from Ken Paxton. This whole case is a whole lot of nothing. I make my living trying cases to Texas juries. Cases are supposed to be decided only upon the evidence. But I do wonder, are we really going to get a fair trial here? Have you already decided based on what is politically expedient or what's best for you personally? Or is it even possible to get a fair hearing? Especially after this case has been tried in the press, Ken Paxton has been convicted in the press based on ignorance, innuendo, and outright lies. So the question is, will you decide based only on the evidence? Because that's your oath. That's what you swore to do, no matter the consequences. And I urge you to do your duty and do it without fear. They say this is the impeachment of a lifetime. But is it? Because depending on what you do here, maybe it will become commonplace. What happens here will have consequences no matter how it turns out. Let's be clear. If this misguided effort is successful, which I feel confident it will not be, the precedent it would set would be perilous for any elected official in the state of Texas. What is being attempted here hasn't happened in our state in 100 years. And unlike other efforts of the past like this one, this scheme was rushed, it was secretive, it was poorly planned, and was wholly unsupported by evidence. Indeed, despite the social media frenzy, the misinformed commentators, the reporters with an agenda, at the end of this, you will come to know what I know, that despite all of us being told that the evidence in this matter is 10 times worse than the public knows, it is instead 100 times less. There is nothing here to support impeachment, nothing. Now, there's been a gag order in this case. That gag order put our team at a distinct disadvantage. That gag order prevented us from rebutting this false narrative created by a frenzied press. The gag order, of course, didn't stop those media members with agendas or those media outlets aligned with the House managers, and they were calling for Ken Paxton's head. We've heard in the media about burner phones. There are no burner phones, but we couldn't respond. We've heard about secret email addresses. It's so secret that every person on Ken Paxton's staff used the same type of email address because they were traveling to China. There's no secret email address, but we couldn't respond. We've heard about Uber rides for Ken Paxton in Vegas, Chicago, or to even nightclubs. Those were manufactured lies, but we couldn't respond. We've even heard from the press about cakes from H-E-B, stolen pens, pilfered sport coats. Outright foolishness, but we couldn't respond. We heard about house renovations supposedly paid for by the manipulating boogeyman, Nate Paul. That never happened. Ken Paxton and Angela Paxton paid for their house renovations, and I'm going to show that absolutely 100%. They know it, but yet they still stood up here and repeated that lie. Let's talk a little bit about some background. In 2015, Ken Paxton ran against the anointed candidate for Attorney General Dan Branch. Branch represented Highland Park and the political elites. Dan Branch was the establishment candidate. Ken Paxton beat him soundly. Almost immediately after that win, Ken Paxton was on the receiving end of a clearly political indictment at the hands of rivals within his own party. That saga continues to this day with a pair of unelected special prosecutors nudging it forward year after year with the expectation and hope that someday they will get paid. Nevertheless, despite being indicted and despite a very public lawsuit that makes the exact same allegations that are being made here, Ken Paxton easily won his last primary, as he has in every election. In fact, Ken Paxton thumped the establishment candidate, who this last time happened to be a Bush. And it wasn't even close. Ken Paxton won 68% to 32% in the primary. Now think about that. General Paxton trounced the establishment candidate, a member of the Bush dynasty, and beat him badly. And incidentally, as an aside, did you realize that the day before the vote for this impeachment was had, that same Bush applied to renew his law license? Let's put this proceeding in context. Almost 30 million people live in the state of Texas. Texans chose at the voting booth who they wanted to be their attorney general, despite the same baseless allegations that are being made here. But because of what this House has done, only 30 people out of almost 30 million will decide whether Ken Paxton is allowed to serve in the office he was voted into. That's not how it's supposed to work. That's not democratic. What could be less democratic than 30 people deciding who serves as the Attorney General of Texas instead of the 4.2 million people who voted to put him there? Every election season we hear, your vote is your voice. It's important to go vote to be a good member of society. We hear about the sanctity of the right to vote. We hear that people fought and died for the right to vote. We hear every vote should count. Yet, to get here, Texas House took away the votes of over 4 million Texans who voted for Ken Paxton, and they did it in only a 4-hour hearing. There is a right way for Texas voters to remove someone from office. It's called vote against them. Who the people want, who the people have voted for, should matter. Let me give you some names. George P. Bush, Eva Guzman, Louis Gohmert, Dan Branch, Barry Smitherman, Joe Jaworski, Rochelle Garza, Justin Nelson. Those are just some of the people that Texans decided they did not want to be their attorney general. The people chose General Paxton. Do their votes matter? People are watching. The will of those Texans should not be subverted. And people of Texas, let me say this. I am very happy that these proceedings are being live streamed. I think it is good that Texas voters can hear every bit of evidence or the complete lack of evidence that supports this from both sides. I'm sure that the more than 4.2 million people who voted for Ken Paxton will want to hear why. 30 people are deciding his fate. And through all of this, we must not forget, Ken Paxton, for the last 8 years, has operated the most aggressive, effective litigation apparatus of any attorney general's office in the country. According to the pundits, Ken Paxton was never supposed to be serving in statewide office. But Ken Paxton is very much serving. Look at his record. Under his leadership, the AG's office has won major cases for Texas on immigration, the lives of the unborn, religious freedom, and the continuous overreach by the federal government on our everyday lives. Under his direction, the AG's office has sued the Obama and Biden administrations more than any other AG office in the country. Even CNN has called Texas a legal graveyard for Biden's policies. And under his watch, and with his personal involvement, the Attorney General's office has recovered billions of dollars for Texas taxpayers, including $3 billion against Big Pharma as a result of the opioid crisis. It has been said, but I think it's worth repeating. Ken Paxton is the best attorney general in the country, period. All of this, of course, begs the most pressing question. If Ken Paxton is so good at his job and routinely defeats his political opponents at the ballot box, then what the devil are we doing here? We know this entire process took less than 2 months with fewer than 15 witnesses, none of which were ever put under oath. Shouldn't this investigation, if done right, have taken a whole lot longer? After all, this historic procedure took an entire year the last time it was used, with sworn testimony taken by the committee, in open hearings, giving the respondent an opportunity to be heard, to confront his accusers. So why was it so short this time? Why did it happen when it did? What was the rush? Because if they had taken their time and done it right, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't hear about burner phones. We wouldn't hear about house renovations. We wouldn't hear about secret Uber rides. We wouldn't hear any of that foolishness because they would have delved into it and saw that it was all false. So why? I'll tell you why. On May 19th, 2023, Speaker Dade Phelan was so drunk while running House business, he could barely even hold the gavel. And that drunkenness was on video and was on the internet for the entire world to see. I'm sure you've seen the video as well. 4 days later, on May 23rd, Ken Paxton issued a statement and called for Dade Phelan to resign. In response, the committee hurriedly met the very next day, conducted a 4-hour hearing, and recommended impeachment the day after that. Because of the rush, the House didn't bother to vet this foolishness, and now they've put it right in your lap for you to do the work that they failed to do. This impeachment was the perfect marriage of a group of representatives fueled by a powerful lobbyist and led by a drunken speaker seeking political vengeance. It was also a result of a group of uninformed civil litigants and their attorneys who were motivated by money. The House's General Investigating Committee proceeded in a rush, in secret, so secret, in fact, that the only people who could have testified and brought actual evidence and exonerated Ken Paxton were not even called. I hope you will look at the evidence. I hope you'll really look at the evidence. I have faith in this body that you will actually see the evidence and make an informed decision. I want to focus just on a few of the impeachment articles. There's so many of them, I wouldn't have time to go through every one. But I think one that you might be interested in is Article 10. That's the article where the House managers have argued that Ken Paxton's house renovations were paid for by Nate Paul. And you've heard that lie repeated over and over and over again in the press, and it's false. The House managers adopted this lie about a non-existent bribe and repeated it with no evidence, nothing. The news media endlessly amplified this lie without ever documenting it. And then it's been repeated over and over, and even repeated by my colleague today. Hear this, press corps. Ken Paxton and Angela Paxton paid for their house renovations. Period. You will see in this case a STEAM team estimate. The Paxton's house in Terrytown had some water damage. STEAM team came out to correct the water damage. We're going to show you those documents where USAA claim was made to pay for that. You will see that the Paxtons had fits with the insurance company, just like all of us have at one time or another, trying to get that claim paid. You will see that Angela Paxton specifically was involved in talking through some of the repairs they were going to do as part of that process. They were going to do some upgrades, and you'll see mind-numbing pictures of Angela and Ken Paxton at Home Depot, at Lowe's, pricing stoves, pricing countertops, trying to get the best buy, and ultimately deciding that despite what you hear about granite, with all due respect, Senator Paxton, their countertops are just old ratty tile. And they didn't get a new stove. And they didn't get to change out their cabinets. But that's not what you've heard in the press. I'm going to show you the USAA docs. I'm going to show you that on September 16th of 2020, USAA made its final determination of what they would pay. They paid for Steam Clean, the original contractor, and the second contractor was Cupertino Builders. And you've heard, that's a foul. Buzbee in the press conference, he showed Cupertino Builders' invoice. That company didn't exist. Well, guess what? It did. It absolutely did. I'm going to show you the documents, and you're going to see that this article is false, just like every other one. You're going to see the USAA determination. You're going to see that USAA knew that they had another contractor. You're going to see a text from the trustee back and forth between Ken Paxton, where Ken Paxton says, I have this invoice, I have to pay it. You're going to see all that, and you're going to see the wire come from the Paxton's bank account and go into Cupertino Builders' bank account. You're going to see the front side of the transaction and the back side of the transaction, and you're going to conclude, like I've concluded, like everybody has to conclude, that these folks were pinching pennies. They were trying to update and renovate their house, and there were a lot of things they just couldn't afford. I'm going to show you pictures ad nauseum of their house, and you will conclude what I've concluded is the Paxtons have been defamed over and over in the press and by the House. Now, the second so-called bribe, Nate Paul, the boogeyman Nate Paul gave Ken Paxton $25,000. Oh, goodness gracious. Do you know when he gave that money? October 2018. Years before any of these allegations ever existed. Years before any of the acts allegedly that occurred ever occurred. Think about their theory. Their theory is Nate Paul in October of 2018 was thinking, he was so manipulative and so smart that he knew at sometime years in the future, he may be needing something from Ken Paxton. Here's the problem with that. He gave money to people in this very chamber as well. Ken Paxton wasn't the only recipient of a campaign donation, but let's focus on campaign donations. Incidentally, in 2018, Ken Paxton raised millions upon millions of dollars, a $25,000 donation, although it sounds like a lot of money. Ken Paxton is a great fundraiser. He raises a lot of money, and that donation ain't even a blip on the radar screen. But let's think about that. Campaign donations can't be bribes. They are not bribes. Do any of us believe that a campaign donation in here is a bribe? You know how often I get calls for campaign donations? A lot. Are those bribes? No. If campaign donations were bribes, everybody in this town would be impeached. Just line up. Once we finish Ken Paxton, we'll start impeaching everybody else. I want to shift our focus from the time I have and address what could be the elephant in the room. There's been some salacious allegations made about Ken Paxton. The argument is that Nate Paul provided a job for a woman named Laura Olson. It doesn't hold any water. Laura Olson applied for a job. Laura Olson got a job. You're going to see the employment contract. You're going to see what her salary was. You're going to see her pay stubs. You're going to hear about the work that she did. And you're also going to hear that she continues to do that work today. Today. That was not a bribe. That was a job sought out and received, and she's doing real work today. You'll see the pay stubs and you'll see the employment application. Now, you've heard so much. My colleague talked about how Ken Paxton turned over the keys to the AG's office to Nate Paul. Remember hearing that? Totally false. One of the things you're going to see in this case is that Ken Paxton got nothing from Nate Paul, and Nate Paul got nothing from Ken Paxton. Let's look at what Nate Paul got from the AG's office. Nate Paul believed that the feds had targeted him. He believed that the feds had violated his civil rights. He believed that an affidavit, a warrant for the search of his home and businesses had been altered. He believed it, still believes it today. He didn't know where to go. He went to Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton sent him to the Travis County District Attorney's office, who then turned around and referred it back because of conflicts. There were conflicts. But what did Nate Paul get from that? No bankruptcies were averted. No foreclosures were stopped. No FBI agents were indicted. No FBI agents had to respond to any subpoena. Nothing. Nate Paul got nothing. If that was an attempted bribe, that was the least effective one in the history of the United States. You're going to see Nate Paul got nothing. In fact, you will also see email after email after email of Nate Paul and his lawyers sending letters to the AG's office, madder than a hornet's nest. You're not doing your job. You're not doing your job. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. We're going to sue the AG's office. Does that sound like somebody who has the keys to the AG's office? It sounds like somebody who might be a little entitled and thinks that public officials should jump when he says jump, maybe jump and hope he jumps high enough. But one thing is clear, Nate Paul got nothing, and he was very unhappy about it. He did not think the AG's office was doing its job, and he sent email after email, letter after letter, culminating in a letter where he threatened a lawsuit against the AG's office. You never saw those emails, did you? You never saw those letters, did you? You never even heard about them. The press knows about them. They didn't report that, did they? This idea that the AG's office harmed the Midi Foundation. Do you know who the Midi Foundation is? Do you know their history? Do you know who the first AG was that had issue with the Midi Foundation? Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott sued the Midi Foundation for all kinds of foolishness. They had one person indicted. They had another person who allegedly beat their wife and child. There was like a lot of turnover. And in this particular instance, you will see why the AG's office decided to intervene. There's a memo that lays out the tortured history of the Midi Foundation and the decision-making matrix. And every single person in the chain of command signed off, including these so-called whistleblowers, to intervene in the Midi Foundation case. Not to protect charity. See, this is the misconception. The AG's office is not there to protect charities, as has been alleged. The AG's office is there to protect the public's interest in charity. In other words, those are donated funds, and the charity better take care of its P's and Q's. And the Midi Foundation was not. And Nate Paul was so mad that the AG's office wasn't doing more. The AG's office intervened. The intervention lasted 3 months, and the AG's office dropped the case once they saw what was going on. And remember this, you'll see the memo where not only did the entire chain of command decide to intervene in the Midi Foundation litigation, but also decided to open an investigation of the Midi Foundation. Have you heard that in the press? This is what we're up against. We are trying a case not here in front of you, honorable members. We're trying a case where we're getting prosecuted in the press. And so here we are, the baseless allegations thrown at us, shotgun approach, throw it against the wall, see what will stick, and make them respond. That's what this is. That's what this is, and that's what it has been. There's a reason my colleague did not go through any facts to support this, because there are no facts to support this. And let's also talk briefly about this so-called midnight opinion. Again, utter foolishness. Did you know on the very day that the informal guidance was issued, they issued another one the very same time frame? Like the very same day? You want to know how many foreclosures were stopped by the informal guidance? 0. They didn't report that either, did they? And you didn't hear that either, did you? Many of these articles, I would respectfully suggest, if you look at what's alleged and you look at the evidence, you'll dismiss it out of hand. This is a good one. They claim that this was an AG's opinion, this so-called midnight opinion. On the very face of the document, it says this is informal guidance. It's not a 402 legal opinion. That should have been the reason that should have been dismissed. But we will show that to you. We will prove that to you, and that article should be disposed of in short work. Now, finally, let me talk about these ex-employees. One of the facts that I find to be the most egregious with regard to these ex-employees is that they made assumptions about their boss, but they did not raise those assumptions with their boss. Many of the issues in this particular case, most of those so-called whistleblowers participated in and signed off on. You know what the genesis of all this is? Remember I talked about the referral to from the district attorney's office to the AG's office? They were unaware that the district attorney's office had done a second referral that did not go through the AG's office. It went directly to this young man, Brandon Kammick. And so when they saw that Brandon Kammick had gotten subpoenas that went to some financial institutions, their heads almost exploded. And rather than asking the questions, calling the DA's office, finding out what was going on, they just assumed that this young man, this young lawyer who was being paid $300 an hour, because that was the rate, and that's why we got somebody like Brandon Kammick. But they assumed that he was off doing something untoward. And they never asked the questions, why would you be subpoenaing a financial institution? Because it was a second referral from the DA's office, a second referral that gave him the authority to investigate bid rigging. We all know there was bid rigging going on in Austin. That was what the DA referred to the AG's office to investigate, not prosecute, investigate. They assumed the worst. And instead of asking their boss, you know what they did instead? They sent a letter to the FBI saying that Brandon Kammick had appeared in front of a grand jury. He never appeared in front of any grand jury. The subpoenas were prepared by the DA's office. All he did was DocuSign them. And they sent that letter to the FBI. They came and met with some of the governor's staff. They came and may have met with some of you even, instead of meeting with their boss that they claimed they were loyal to. And you want to know what's most egregious? They sent letters and they took Ken Paxton's name off the letterhead. Now you think about that for a minute. Oh, these people were retaliated against and fired. Ken Paxton was trying to hide something. Let me just ask you point blank. If one of your staff, your chief of staff, decided that he disagreed or she disagreed with one of your actions, and decided when you were out of the office in Ohio trying to put together the Google case with a bunch of other AGs to recover monies for the state of Texas while you're gone, they get together, they send everybody home, and 8 of them meet, and they take Ken Paxton's name off the letterhead and start sending correspondence without his name. Imagine if your chief of staff did that. You would fire them on the spot. If you're a subordinate and you disagree with your boss's course of action, you raise it with her or him, and if there's still a disagreement, you resign. That's how it works. What you don't do is try to hijack the office, wage a coup, or all the other things that did. Sabotage grants. You know, they tried to sabotage the grants that the AG's office would receive. Millions of dollars of grants. They tried to sabotage the office. You're going to hear a much different story when you hear the evidence. A much different story. And let me finish with this. There's a young man named Drew Wicker. He's been all over the news. You remember who I'm talking about? I think my colleague made it clear. And We all know that you guys read. I mean, obviously you pay attention to what's going on. That's part of your job. There's a young man named Drew Wicker, a good young man. He was interviewed by the House investigators. I want you to watch and listen to that interview, because they asked him, did you ever deliver anything to Nate Paul? No, never happened. They came back 5 minutes later. When you delivered things to Nate Paul, how many things did you deliver? This is how they did this young man, who feels like he's in between a rock and a hard place. He's friends with some of the people that quit or were fired, and he still says that Angela and Ken Paxton are like family to him. And they squeezed him. And they squeezed him. He's the one, you may recall, that said, I was there in the kitchen, and Angela had expressed that she wanted granite countertops, and Ken Paxton was there with me, and Kevin Wood, the contractor, says, let me check with Nate. And then we heard about $20,000 granite countertops. I don't know where those are, Senator Paxton. I don't know where those are. What you'll see instead is I have the samples that when they went to Home Depot and Lowe's, and they sampled and they priced it and they decided they couldn't afford it. Nate Paul had nothing whatever to do with it, and Drew Wicker knows that is true as well. We look forward to putting on this case, and we hope you'll listen to all the evidence. We hope that you'll make a decision not based on political expediency, but based on the evidence you're going to hear. And remember, the burden of proof. It's not we throw out allegations and you say, oh, that sounds sexy, I'm voting for impeachment. They have to prove their case by the numbers beyond a reasonable doubt. They won't be able to do that. And on that point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague for my time remaining, Dan Cogdell, who has some points he'd like to make. Dan?